Welcome to my channel, where the scariest stories come to life. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into the horror. The idea to travel the country arose early in my senior year of high school. A teacher suggested I read On the Road by Jack Kerouac. I became so engrossed in the book that I was already planning my trip less than halfway through reading it. Originally, the idea was to take the trip once I'd finished college, but after some sage advice from my dad, I decided to move it up. Do it now. Life has a bad habit of getting in the way as you age. With my folks' support, I took a gap year and headed out the day after graduation. My parents believed I was traveling on a Greyhound. I had other plans. However, I rode the bus only as far as my first stop and got off there. I'd see the US the same way my folks had. I was going to hitchhike along the way. I had a few strange encounters and more than one near-death experience. What follows is perhaps the worst of them all. On this day, I was traveling through southern Missouri. As night approached, the elderly gentleman who had picked me up some 5 miles prior said he was going to have to let me off. I believed he lived nearby and didn't want me to know where. Just happy for the ride, I bid him goodbye, and he drove away into the setting sun. Probably half an hour passed as I walked along the road shoulder, my cheap headlamp lighting the way before me. This section of road was in the middle of nowhere, so very little traffic passed me. The sun had long set, and the temperature seemed pleasant. I felt well rested and wasn't going out of my way to catch a ride. Nonetheless, an old pickup soon passed me and pulled over about 20 yards ahead. I stopped and watched for a moment just to be sure he was stopping for me. He must have realized this. The driver hung his left arm out of the window and waved me forward. I began jogging toward the truck. I was almost at the bumper when the truck lurched forward a few yards. This is a common joke that drivers play on hitchhikers. I'm sure you've seen it in at least one movie. I tried to be a good sport and laughed it off. Once again, I quickly approached the truck, and once again, the truck lurched forward a few yards. This is part of the game, and I continued to be lighthearted about it, despite getting very annoyed. This is usually where the joke stops and the driver lets you in. Unfortunately, my new friend didn't follow the rules this time. The driver let me get up to the passenger door, and as I looked over at him, before I could get a word out, he slammed on the gas and screeched away. I was fed up by this point. Without thinking, I made a massive mistake. I gave the guy the finger. It's a gesture I'd seen a million times growing up, and I'd never seen anything more than a few crosswords given in exchange. However, for some reason, as I've grown older, I've come into contact with more and more people who react with outright fury to this gesture, and I had just met one. I was standing still as the truck began slipping off into the dark, but as soon as I stuck up my finger, the darkness was illuminated by taillights. At first, I thought he was trying to lure me in again, but I soon realized he was making a 3-point turn and coming back. A sick feeling churned in my gut. I had a collapsible baton that I carried for protection, and I slipped it from my bag. I thought he might be coming back to start a fight. The strange part was that as he grew closer, the truck got faster, and the grill was aimed right at me. I estimated that when he was roughly 20 yards away and closing fast, I turned and ran. For all intents and purposes, I was now running for my life. I tried to shake him by cutting into the field alongside the road, but he followed. Then I cut across to the other side, but that side was enclosed by a metal tubular fence I had to quickly climb. To my amazement, he plowed the fence over like it wasn't there. I looped back around and out onto the road. He was now very close. I could feel the heat of his engine on my back, and I could also feel my body beginning to wear out. One misstep or stumble and I'd be smashed. Perhaps 10 seconds later, I noticed a turn-off coming up on my left. When I was close enough, I cut off the pavement and down the road. Up ahead, there were some bushes and a wooded area. I summoned up all the power I had left and pulled away. I reached the trees and dove into a ravine. I switched off my headlamp and crawled under some fallen trunks. It was the first time since this began that I felt safe, but still, it wasn't quite over. I lay as still as I could and tried to slow my breathing. I could hear the low rumble of the truck's engine, passing just yards away. All of a sudden, the woods lit up like a summer day. Unknown to me, that crazy redneck had a spotlight mounted on his truck. The beam passed by my hiding place more than once. At one point, I was sure he had seen me, but he never did. He gradually got further and further down the road until I felt safe enough to move. Over the course of that night, I crawled deeper into the woods as light would occasionally pass by my hiding place, but I was now too far away to be seen. Around 4 a.m., I finally heard the engine rev up and the tire screech as he sped away, this time for good. I remained in my last hiding spot until well after dawn. The chase had worn me out so much that I fell asleep, despite still being terrified. Just after 10 a.m., I quietly and carefully stepped from the trees. This guy wasn't anywhere I could see, but I stayed off the road for the rest of that week. Early that Sunday morning, I got a ride from a family going into Oklahoma for a rodeo. I kept my ordeal to myself, though. I didn't want to lay my problems on complete strangers. As we passed into Oklahoma, I let out a big sigh of relief. I'm sure they thought I was crazy, but they were too nice to say anything. That night on the road still haunts my dreams occasionally. My meeting with the family begins a new, interesting chapter in my own on-the-road story, but I'll save that for another time. Let's just say, I spent a night in the hospital after a run-in with a nasty bull. Until we meet again, friends, stay free, and never grow old. After my discharge from the military, I had a lot of trouble adjusting. My wife could tell I was struggling, especially hard one morning, and suggested I go for a walk in the nearby woods. To her credit, it turned out to be the best thing for me. I had forgotten how peaceful nature could be. I walked aimlessly for a while until I came upon a log and sat down. I'm not sure how long I sat there, just taking in all of God's creation. I do know that I didn't want to go back. The only thing awaiting me was screaming children and the overwhelming crush of responsibility, and that's when I came up with an idea. Reluctantly, I returned to the house and pulled my wife into the bathroom so we could talk. We each took a seat, and I explained my plan to her. She agreed without hesitation, and that was the moment I knew she was too good for me. With her blessing, I gathered my kit together and headed back into the woods. For the next 3 days, I camped and explored almost every inch of those woods. I lived off the land, taking only what I needed, and when I emerged, it was like being reborn. From that point on, nature would be my retreat. Another year passed, and I continued my little escapes, as my wife called them. I initially stuck close to home, but soon I began exploring further. This brings us to the focus of my story. Not far from me was a large tract of forest used by motorcycle and ATV riders. I had been curious to check it out, but wanted to wait until traffic decreased with the arrival of colder weather. When the time came, I packed up all my kit onto my old Honda Quad and began my journey. I stuck to the major trails at first. As I became somewhat comfortable with my surroundings, I cut off onto an older, long and used one. It was about 4 p.m. when I came across an open area near a creek. I made camp and watched the sunset from a chair I'd made with my own 2 hands. The next morning, I was getting water when I noticed an old shack sitting under some trees just on the other side of the creek. I planned to check it out. After a quick breakfast, things got away from me, and it was almost lunch before I got around to it. I didn't expect there to be much to see, but I noticed the windows had been covered with burlap, a sure sign of use. I decided to approach from the back. I picked up the tracks of a large automobile, like an SUV. They were very fresh, probably no more than a day old. Upon reaching the front door, I saw that 2 padlocks had been placed there. No more than 30 seconds passed before the sound of a truck echoed down the road. I didn't realize I was running until I reached the tree line. I was hiding and didn't even know why. I watched as a white Silverado parked in front of the shack. The passengers stayed inside for almost a minute, then almost in unison, two men stepped out from the Chevy. Both were armed with carbines and wearing armor. The two men stood guard while a third man stepped from the front passenger seat and unlocked the door. The driver soon joined him, followed by the two lookouts. This had to be cartel business, and now I was trapped, stuck between a path to safety and a group of potential heartless killers. I'd always assumed they operated on this side of the border, but now I had proof. An hour passed, and I was still no closer to escape. The two guards were doubtlessly watching from the windows, just waiting for one little move. The SIG on my hip would do little against two men with rifles. If I was found, my family would never know what had become of me. There was no way I could do that to them. I had no choice but to sit tight and wait. Fortunately, my respite soon came. The group of men exited the building, one carrying two duffel bags. The guards took one last look around, and the Chevy disappeared down the same road it had arrived on. No sooner had the truck disappeared from sight than I bolted from cover, ran across the creek, gathered my things, and gunned my quad back to civilization. The long ride gave me time to decide my next course of action. I could act as if nothing had happened or go to the cops. By the time I arrived home, I had made my choice. I drove my truck directly to the sheriff and told them what I'd seen. I had no proof of any illegal activity, per se, but they told me they'd check it out. My good deed had been done. It was up to the cops now. But as 9 months went by and no news reached me, my curiosity got the best of me. I took the Honda back out to take another look. I took a position not far from my old camp and set up. I was shocked by what I saw. The old shack was no longer standing. It wasn't completely gone, but from what I could tell, it had been burned down. I decided to take a closer look. On the scene, things were much clearer. Not much remained other than some assorted small pieces of metal and charred furniture. I was happy to see it gone, but a little flame of curiosity still burns inside me regarding exactly how it got that way, what had become of the men I'd seen, and what they had been doing. I suppose I'll never know. I often remember that little shack in the middle of nowhere and wonder how many forgotten places like it exist in this country, and what awful things may be going on inside them. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.